Today I'm going to teach you how to mark and annotate your books, and in doing so hopefully teach you a more active way of thinking and wrestling with ideas, how to actually own a book, because you don't own a book when you buy a book. That's just one very shallow form of ownership. You own a book when you start marking the book. People talk about reading between the lines, but we're going to talk about how to write between the lines. And there are a few different types of book owners. There's the type of owner who has his library or his shelf filled with the best paperbacks, the most, the bestsellers and the latest reads and all these big intellectual books, but he never cracks them open. They're all pristine, they're clean, they're preserved. He never touches them. This is not a reader, this is not a man or a woman who is a thinker, this is not someone who engages with the great ideas. The second type of reader is somebody who, and this was the type of reader I was for so many years, somebody who owns a great deal of books and does read them, does take them down from the shelf and engage with them, but is too worried about marking them and getting them dirty, so their books end up looking as clean and pristine as when they first bought them. And then the third type of reader, the reader that we want to become, the deep reader, is the kind of reader whose books are absolutely covered in ink. They're dogged, the spine's cracked, they've got notes falling out of them, bookmarks, all this sort of stuff, and they've just got annotations, squiggles, lines, notes, indexes in the front and back. And it's the sort of book where you can't lend this book to somebody else. So it's like, oh, can I borrow your copy of so-and-so? Well, no, because one, you're not going to appreciate it because you're going to be so distracted by my notes. And two, I don't want to give a piece of my soul. When you go to, when travelers go to undiscovered islands and they find tribes people, they take their camera and they take a picture, and the tribes people end up killing them because they think that the traveler has taken a piece of their soul. And in a sense, when you take a photograph, you do take a piece of somebody's soul. But in a very even more real sense, when you take my copy of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, or you take my copy of Aristotle's Ethics, you are taking my soul. You're taking me at the most vulnerable. You're taking my thought process at the most basic, all the way through to the most complex. You're taking me at my most fundamental essence of me learning and improving, and that's quite something to take. Now, if you're worried about marking your books, that's quite an understandable thing, because if you have a really nice book, you probably don't want to mark it. I recently got a 3-volume hardback set, the Everyman Library edition of War and Peace by Tolstoy, and there is no way in hell I'm going to mark this gorgeous piece of work. I will get a cheap version if I want to mark it, or I will use a journal or something. Or there's this book, this copy of Great Expectations, which is absolutely gorgeous with all the original sketches by Boz, and you can see the typography is just lovely. Now, I've got a few of these editions, and while I have actually marked them, I won't be marking this one because I just find it as an item just so pleasurable. I'll get a cheap copy. Now, as for my other books, which I'm going to show you in this video, I mark the hell out of them. So in this video, and there's different ways of marking. I'm going to give you a quick overview to my marking system, or a system that you might be able to use, and then we'll go through different types of books to see how that system evolves and changes depending on the book. We're going to look at Anna Karenina, so a nice bit of fiction. We're also going to look at Sherlock Holmes, so you can see how I mark a novella. We're going to look at Plato's Republic, so a bit of philosophy. How do you mark and annotate philosophy? We're also going to look at a book that I highly recommend, How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler. Adler's ideas on reading are foundational for what I think about marking a book and annotating. I'm very much a disciple of Adler in the way that I'm a disciple of Aristotle. We're going to look at John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, show how I marked that, another philosophical tract. We are going to look at poetry. Yeah, how do you mark poetry? At least, how do I mark a poetry? How do I make a book of poetry my own? So we're going to look at Rumi, and if you like Rumi, by the way, I've got a podcast on Rumi, and we'll talk about how to consolidate reading by doing things like podcasts as well. We're going to look at another bit of philosophy, Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche. And we are also going to look at King Lear, because the way I've been marking King Lear is a bit different from how I've been marking everything else. And also, to boot, we'll be looking at, very briefly, the Bible and my journal. And we'll also be looking at how I mark on Kindle with a little bit of Aristotle and a few other works of criticism, stuff like that. So let's jump into it. Now, here's a quick overview. We're going to type this out and then I'll show you the actual books. So my main system Firstly, I create an index, and that could be on the front page, it can be in the back page, anywhere where there's a lot of space. And what I'll do is, as I'm picking up key themes or topics or things that I want to return to, I'll write out a list of themes or ideas, and then I'll put the page number so that I can easily reference. So if I think, hey, that's a theme on X that I want to return to, well, you know what, if that writer talks about X in a lot and it makes a lot of good points, but you want to be able to see it at a quick glance and filter through, that's what an index is for. That's really good. Of course, you're going to have underlining, and underlining is just for like major points or statements that you like. You can underline something because you like the turn of phrase. You might even put a little note in the corner like S, like that might mean sound. You just like the sound. Underlining, you can be liberal with it, but remember that underlining is the shallowest form of annotation. And just because you underline something doesn't mean you're going to remember it. So you can be underline as much as you want, but it's always good to underline in conjunction with a thought in note form. It doesn't have to make any sense. It could just be a little keyword or something like that. Underlining is the foundation, but then you also want like vertical lines at the margin. I usually do 3 vertical strikes, and that's to emphasize something. And like I'll use these quite sparingly because I want to flick through and then be able to see quickly where I've found the most forceful and impactful passages. You also want to do a star or an asterisk, and this is very sparing. So I might ration myself 5 to 10 asterisks per work, obviously depending on how big the work is. But this is like, if I absolutely could only pick 5 to 10 things that I really, really want to return to and pick apart and analyze and recommend and talk about, that's when you use the stars. So really for the start, you use the stars for things that just mean so much to you, okay? Now you also might want to put numbers. So often when you're reading something philosophical or some sort of scientific tract or something like that, you'll see a logical argument and you can follow the steps of deduction. But to make this easier, what I'll do is I'll put a little number in a little circle 1 and then a little number in a circle 2, 3 at the point in the paragraph where the argument breaks down. So that when I want to come back to the argument, I can quickly see it again at a glance. And as you noticed, I keep saying I want to come back and see it. The reason we annotate is because rereading is an important part of reading. You annotate books that you have fallen in love with, that have swept you up, that have meant something to you, and that you want to return to. The first reading is just a cursory reading. It's getting to know the characters if it's a fictional work, or it's getting to know the arguments. But the real reading comes in the rereading, and a critical part of that is marking the books so you can come back and read quicker or spend more time on certain things that are more important than others. Again, you might also want to put notes in the margin, like if there's a point that the author has made, you could also reference another page and say, oh, this is page 111. Well, the author made a similar argument on page 57. So you just do a little page 57, p.57, and then maybe you go back to page 57 and you put p.11, and that's a good way of linking disparate pages. You also want to do some circling, and circling I reserve for key words. These are like thesis statements or core ideas. So when someone's doing a logical argument, you just pick out the words that are repeated or the words that contain all the assumptions of the sentence or the important words. Again, that's a way of cementing the argument in your mind without having to memorize the whole thing word for word. So what you can do when you're relating the argument to someone else is you remember the key words and you can put it in your own words. That's a really great way of syntactically reading. And so you circle words that stand out. For me as well, if I'm doing this with a fictional work, it's easier obviously if you're doing it with philosophical or non-fiction stuff. But if I'm, say, doing it with a long piece of work from Dickens or Tolstoy or something, I'll often circle themes or words that seem congruent with a character. For example, recently I did a lot of circling of the word understand in Tolstoy's Anna Karenina because I noticed that Anna uses languages of understanding a lot. So I started thinking, if this work was an opera, for example, and that's a good way of thinking about your work, is like, how would this work be represented if it was a painting or a piece of music? I thought, well, understand was Anna's leitmotif. So I thought that was quite interesting. And then also when you're doing that, you can mark how characters change over the course of a novel, which might be fun, might be interesting. might be illuminating. And then her husband, I kept circling words to do with jealousy, and then I would break down how he dealt with jealousy and his introspection and stuff like that. And there's no specific rhyme or reason for what you're underlining, but it's things that you feel are important. And for me, a lot of my reading is, I will read something that I know I'll do a book review or a video or a podcast on or a lecture or talk to somebody else about. So I'm marking stuff that I think will be good to package up and introduce to other people for their benefit. That's another good thing as well, because if you read a book with the aim to then do a book review, then you are reading in a more alert and active way. It's not passive. And you'll find that you might read a page slower because you're pausing and you're thinking between the lines and you're doodling in the margins and stuff like that. You read it slower, but you'll keep it in your blood. And then when you return to it, you pick up, oh, this bit. And then you tell someone about it. And then it's just yours forever. The book actually becomes you. You own the book. And of course, you just write in the margins as well. Like, often I'll just do my thinking on the side, and sometimes my thoughts look a bit silly and simplistic, and I'll just ask why, or why this, or I'll argue with the author. I'll have a conversation with them, or I'll try and relate what they're saying to other books that I'm reading at the time, or current events. So if I'm reading Mill, in the margin, you'll see me talking about Nietzsche. And then when I get to Nietzsche, you'll see me talking about Mill. Or when I'm reading On Liberty, I'll think, oh, well, how does that relate to our COVID-19 times and how the government introduced lockdown and stuff like that? And I'm always trying to relate everything I'm reading to my current life and my current reading. Otherwise, reading's not really valuable. It doesn't exist in a vacuum, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, enough waffle. Let's look at some books and how I marked them. They're all going to be a little bit different, but I imagine if you look at a few of them, you'll be able to come up with your own system that looks a bit like mine and you kind of understand the philosophy. So let's start with a book that I just recently picked up. This is How to Read and Why by Harold Bloom. I actually didn't like Bloom. I had a knee-jerk emotional reaction to him because he called popular writers like J.K. Rowling and Stephen King slop, and so I had a very negative view of him, I suppose because he reminded me of some snobby academics at Oxford. But I spoke to my very good friend who was a huge fan of Bloom. He changed my mind on him. I ended up buying his books, and even though I might disagree with him on some things, I did reserve some bias, and I've actually really enjoyed this book. I think it's fantastic. It's not as good as Adler's How to Read a Book, but it is really, really good, and I would recommend it. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is it shows how I organise an index in real time, because I've not fully finished this book, but you can see here, if we flip to the front page, you can see that I've made a little index on ideas. So one is how to restore the way we read. And you can see I've broke it down. Oh, here's an idea on page 23, and I've put it in a quick statement. Clear your mind of Kant. If you read the book, you know what that means. And then the second one, page 24. Do not attempt to improve your neighbour or your neighbourhood by what you read or how you read. And I've done this all the time. If we flick, we can go to page 23 very quickly, and I can pick out that idea, which means something to me. And you can see here, I've obviously, I put a star there because that's one of the few things that I want to return to. And then I've put a box around this thing, and you can see I've put a number in the margin, because that's number 1 in an argument or a series. And then if we flick over, you can see, even though my handwriting's illegible to most people, I can read it. I've got 2, 3, 4, 5 for picking out the main ideas. You can see a little squiggly line here. Usually a squiggly line means more than a normal underlining, but not as much as a box or a circle. But this circle here is a key idea, illumination. And for me, that just means I want to think about the nature of illumination more deeply at some point. And then you can see I've started making a second index, why read, and I've put a few pages, but I haven't elaborated too much. But we can flick to page 195 and you can kind of see what's there. Yes, okay, you can see some more underlinings and stuff. And then, more circlings, the idea of rereading, as you see 3 vertical lines in the margin. And then I've started making another one here. But here's interesting as well, because Bloom talks about Shakespeare a lot. I've decided to pick that out as a theme that I want to return to. So when I want to talk about Shakespeare, I want to reference Bloom and what he said about Shakespeare. So I've made a separate index, and this is all stuff to do with Shakespeare. And you can see that I've made some like little topics. One you can see here, page 194, the topic of change in character and the idea of overhearing characters. And then what I did is I went on and I went to page 201 and then found another topic. Shakespeare versus the Bible. And then, because I read a few more pages, page 205, I realised, he's talking about change, which he talks about on page 194, and he's talking about overhearing again. So I slotted that in, and now I have the topics there. So I can just, at a glance, pick out the topics that I'm interested in. So if we go to page 194, you can see, and there we go. I go there, and I've got all that I need to pick out the main arguments. And if we go to page 205, you can see sort of the same thing going on. And another little star to pick out something. Okay, and then let's see, have I made any more? And then I've put, this is a thing I've just started doing, just favourite passages. And they don't have to relate to anything. They just be something that I really like. And I've got one here, page 29. Obviously I'll put some more as I keep reading. But I like this because Bloom is talking about why we should read. And he says that we read Shakespeare, Dante, Chaucer, Cervantes, Dickens, Proust and all their peers because they more than enlarge life. Pragmatically, they've become the blessing in its true Yahwistic sense of more life into a time without boundaries. We read deeply for varied reasons, most of them familiar, that we cannot know enough people profoundly enough, that we need to know ourselves better, that we require knowledge not just of self and others, but for the way things are. Yet the strongest, most authentic motive for deep reading of the now much abused traditional canon is the search for a difficult pleasure. I'm not exactly an erotics of reading purveyor, and a pleasurable difficulty seems to me a plausible definition of the sublime. But a higher pleasure remains the reader's quest. There is a reader's sublime, and you can see I've actually underlined that and I've wrote runner's high, because I think that's really nice. What Bloom's talking about here is stuff that David Foster Wallace has talked about, and he's talking about flow, basically. It doesn't matter what you call it, but there's a psychological principle called flow. And he says, and it seems the only secular transcendence we can ever attain, except for the even more precarious transcendence we call falling in love. So he's basically saying we read because really good literature is kind of like it gets you high and it makes you feel like you've fallen in love. I urge you to find what truly comes near to you. That can be used for weighing and for considering. Read deeply, not to believe, not to accept, not to contradict, but to learn to share in that one nature that writes and reads. And so I just wrote out loud what I thought, wow, reread this. And that looks a bit silly. Oh, he's wrote wow. No, I was really, really impressed. And look, I've just reread that to you. And if you think that's interesting, then you'll end up picking up the book. So I think it was worth marking. So that's just a few ideas from that one. Let's look at, okay, how to read a book. Again, what I've done here, you'll see, the thing that I want to point out is all the dog-eared pages. Again, like stars, I've reserved these, and I'm quite sparing, although there are quite a few here. These are pages that I really want to return to, and it's stuff that I've obviously resonated with. And of course, I've underlined and done all my usual things. So let's check out the index here. You can see here, I've used the preface to expound on an idea of imaginative literature. This book is actually primarily to do with like non-fiction, but Adler does spend some time talking about imaginative literature, which is actually the kind that I'm more interested in. So I've wrote some ideas down that I've just lifted from the thing, but you know, this is my notebook now. I now own this book, so I can write it here. I don't need a separate space. But let's look at another one. Now this is one that I do know that I've put an index in. This is Plato's Republic, and you can see, where did I decide to put my little index for easy and quick reference. Alright, so on the title page, Republic, and I've just put some things that I want to keep in mind while I'm reading. So this is just a note to me, like while you're reading this great philosophical work, ask yourself, what are the principles? And then ask yourself, once you've stated them, are they adhered to? And then say, what are the problems, what are the terms, what are the propositions that Plato outlines, what are the solutions? And then I remind myself, and this is something I want to remind you to do as well when you're reading, seek first to understand, then agree or disagree and make up your mind with backups. So basically, you're not really allowed to have an opinion on any of these works. You're not allowed to say, oh, I don't like this or don't like that, unless you fully understand it. That's all you want to do, is get to grips with understanding what you're reading. Once you understand it, you then can agree or disagree, but you better have some backups. You better say, I agree because of, and then you better have some arsenal bringing this to the battle, okay? But really, when you're reading, if you just seek to understand, the agreement and disagreement will fall into place naturally. So just make sure you're getting the argument. Let's have a look at a good page. And a good page for me is one that I've absolutely covered. So you can see one here. Yes, okay, you can see I even kind of swear in my margins, because obviously I swear a lot for emphasis. You can see a little star here because I want to return to it. I really like this page. You can see that I've circled terms, friend, enemy, and then I've boxed off a question that I think is worth returning to. Can a moral person harm anyone? And then what I've done in here, in the margin, this is my marginalia, I've connected this, what Plato's talking about, to Viktor Frankl, who wrote my favourite book, Man's Search for Meaning, which I highly recommend. And the thing is, I'm always thinking about Man's Search for Meaning. And Viktor Frankl, although he died a while ago, he's alive in my mind, and he's kind of a friend of mine. And I'm always in dialogue with him in my mind. And what I'll do is I'll bring him into a room with Plato, and I'll say, yo, Frankl, talk to Plato. And like hash it out. What do you think of Plato's? And okay, he's not actually alive, but I'm kind of putting them in a room together, which is really nice. And then that's a good way of reading, and then you come to insights that no one else has come to. And the cool thing about coming to insights no one else comes to is you know your ideas, and you know when someone else has stolen them. So a lot of people have written articles on the internet, and I know that they've plagiarized me, because I've done the reading and I've come up with links to very specific things that link other ridiculously specific things that nobody's talked about and nobody could understand or make the connection, because I know that's my mind thinking in that unique way. And then I've seen someone write an article that's obviously after my article that includes an idea that I arrived at, and I'm like, and I don't mind if people credit me, but when they don't, I'm like, that's a bit, because there's no way you arrived at that, because you don't have the same thought process as me, you don't have the same experience, and that's how you end up owning a book, is you bring you to the book. Anyway, you can see here I'm bringing in Aristotle, which is cool. Where else have I done a lot here? Okay, you can see that I've just linked Zimbardo, a prison experiment thing, and yeah, I'm just kind of thinking out loud on the page, and this is interesting. Apply this to the Instagram generation, I've written. So yeah, obviously Plato wasn't around in the Instagram generation, but you know, this is how you make a book very much your own. Let's look at a bit of fiction. So we're going to look at The Sign of the Four. This one I like. I like the little index I've done. I've not actually finished reading this. I really need to. You can see here, I'm already thinking of some content that I want to put together, and I'm already thinking, well, how can I get the most out of this book? So I asked myself, how would I deduce and rationalize like Sherlock Holmes? And then as I come through and the book answers the question for me, I write a little snippet. Oh, this is how you deduce, and I put a page number. So basically here, I'm just writing out like a how-to guide to being logical and analyzing assumptions. Obviously that's really helpful. Like part of the consulting that I offer is helping people, for example, with PPE, which is politics, philosophy, economics, and the Oxford entrance exam requires you to engage with underlying assumptions. So this is obviously useful for that. As people say, well, fiction and literature, imaginative literature, just it's just for enjoyment, for its own sake, and it's like, yeah, but it can actually improve your life if you know how to read properly. That's why I'm such a fan. And you can see that I've started underlining little things that I believe will be important. And obviously Conan Doyle was writing around the same time as Robert Louis Stevenson. And so I just think it's interesting, this idea of studying character through their handwriting. Again, I don't know what I want to do with that yet. I don't know how useful that's going to be, but I just thought it was interesting. And here's the thing, when you're making marginalia and annotations, don't judge. Don't be too harsh. You're allowed to write silly stuff down. It's allowed to be ill thought out and maybe not important. You don't have to don't put the pressure on yourself to find something earth shattering. It's just whatever interests you. Okay, and that's a good thing to go on. If you're already a reader, your instinct will be quite good anyway, so you just need a bit more practice slowing down and putting the pen across the paper. All right, so that's Sherlock Holmes. What should we look at now? Let's have a look at Nietzsche, a bit more philosophy, I think. I Spoke Zarathustra, and we'll just crack open a random page. Yes, okay, so you can see here, I put a star because I want to return to it, and I've boxed off something that kind of I want to memorize. And the thing about Nietzsche is he's got so many pithy maxims. So obviously, in a way, he's a bit like Aurelius with his meditations. So, he who does not believe in himself always lies. I thought, fuck, that's interesting. I want to remember that. Let's find another one. All right, because I've actually did an article on Nietzsche recently, and you can kind of see where. Okay, yes, of the tarantulas. So if you ever read Nietzsche, just make sure you read this. Start with this. And you can see I've circled terms, so like justice. Justice is a loaded word, and Nietzsche has very specific meanings when he talks about justice and assumptions. So I circled that because I'm going to want to pick apart what does justice mean. All right, and because I've been reading Aristotle at the same time, I might return to Aristotle. I might be like, well, how does Aristotle define justice? And then I'm putting them two in conversation. You can see here, I've put SJW, that means social justice warrior. I'm trying to connect it with the modern day because Nietzsche's talking about, with revenge, your poison makes the soul giddy. So you, preachers of equality, are dealers in hidden revengefulness. And I thought, well, if you think about online hate mobs, like getting people sacked over mean tweets and stuff like that, like I think it'd be very interesting if Nietzsche was alive today. Obviously I've boxed off the word virtue because I think that's an interesting term. And then you can see again, oh, there we go. Yeah, I've linked to Aristotle because Aristotle talks about virtue, and I thought, well, let's bring them in conversation. Nietzsche definitely would have known what Aristotle had to say about all this. They're writing in the same philosophical tradition. And I've put a link here. That means Solzhenitsyn. That's Solzhenitsyn. That's an author. He wrote the Gulag Archipelago, and I wrote Frankl. So obviously I want to tie this into Solzhenitsyn's work and Frankl's work. So I want to get them all in a room chatting to each other. What else can we look at? Let's have a quick look at Mill. All right. So okay, you can see. So often my index will look different depending on the work, or depending on the mood I'm in, or my purpose in reading. You can see this one's quite sparse, but I've decided I want to start making an index on the idea of tyranny and police states. So I've picked out one to get me going on that, page 71. Let's have a look. Yes. All right, so you can see here I've actually linked to the COVID-19 situation, and I'm thinking on paper, and I'm circling my terms and conditions. And then I do this thing called a footnote follow-up. So every time I read a book, I try to get another book out of that book. So if an author makes mention of another work, I'll probably go hunting for it. And then this is how you become really well-read and a bit eclectic in your reading. So actually, I remember Mill had quite a lot, but I decided I wanted to go for this guy called Tocqueville, who I haven't looked at yet, but I did chat to someone about this. Page 81, and then I can find it and, you know, all that stuff. And you can see here, I'm just kind of breaking it down. And look, I even give myself little assignments, homework assignments, like, let's see. Yeah, here's a task. Look up and discuss these. Take them to their logical and moral breaking points. So I'm giving myself like work to do. Like, you don't just read a book, you workshop your whole life through literature. That's what I love about it. Another little, just so you can see, customs to question, church, tax, education, marriage. This is just, it's personal. Okay. All right, let's look at another one. Let's look at some poetry. This is Rumi. Like I said, I've got a podcast on Rumi, and here's the thing, right? So if you want to really own your books, once you're done making them dirty, do a book review in some capacity. You don't have to show anybody, it doesn't have to be live or whatever, but just turn the camera on and start talking about what you've read, or record something if you're camera shy, or write something. It can be by hand, it can be on Word, Pages, Scrivener, whatever. Or talk to somebody. You know, convince someone to read it, or say to someone, hey, yo, can you please read this book with me? I think you'll really like it, and I want to talk to you specifically about it. You get so much more out of it. And I know a lot of people will think that reading is a solitary activity, and I agree that through solitude and reading can come deep insight, but I think even greater insight can come from a little bit of solitude, then interaction, and bringing it into the real world. And because sometimes you'll give someone else your ideas, and they'll pick them apart in a way that you would never even consider on your own, which can be really fun. Anyway, let's look at Rumi. Right, you can just see basically I'm just trying to make the poetic practical, which obviously is something that you don't always want to do, as you know, art for art's sake is a thing. But I think with Rumi, he's kind of like a self-help type guy. And you can see, look, I've actually put a name of a mate who I believe that could help me with questions that these poems are bringing out for me. If we flick a bit further. Yeah, you can see me just putting logical arguments together. Like you can see I've got a little 1 and then 2, and I'm breaking things down. And yeah, I'm drawing in other things that I've read. Again, look, more arguments here, broken down here, arrows everywhere. Again, there's RB, that's very Bradbury, only I would know that. And then here you got Aristotle coming up again, and I've even put a page here. I'm like, go consult page 106, go consult page 62, because that reinforces some of the arguments on this page. So I'm just making everything a little bit easier and tidier for me when it comes to rereading. Okay, so the next one, so I've got my Bible here, and I didn't want to actually mark the Bible, and that's not for religious reasons, because like, I actually have no problem marking the Bible, but just because the text is so tiny and the paper is so thin, it just didn't really make sense. So I wish I did have an actual full journal to show you for how I keep them, but I can explain by looking at this one. You can just kind of see that I'll keep the journal open whilst I go through the Bible, and I'll indicate where I am. Like here I'm in the book of Job, and then I'm just writing, you know, notes. Basically, I might write out the quote, or I might just write out the page number, and then I'll riff on it a little bit. This is one that I just started. And then obviously as this will get full up, I like the moleskin because you've got a theme and topic, and you can make your own contents page. So what I was doing in the actual books, you can do here on a journal, which is really nice. So that's I thought that's worth mentioning. If you really don't want to mark your books, get a journal. And to be honest, even a scrap of paper would do. So you can see I've been reading King Lear, and I've got this scrap of paper put in where I make notes. And with this one I haven't actually marked it, although I have no problem with marking King Lear, but it's an odd one because my way of reading King Lear is focused on putting together a lecture. So I'll read a bit and then I'll watch like a production of King Lear. I'll watch either Peter Brook, or I'll watch some of the, the Anthony Hopkins one, or I'll watch a bit of Akira Kurosawa's Ran. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to show you now my laptop. I'll make notes on my computer. So I'll go into my Word document, and you can kind of see here, again, this is only going to make sense to me, but we'll talk you through. So you can actually just type out some notes as well. So when I'm at my computer, I've got my book by my side, and I thought, well, I'm making a lecture, so I kind of want it all typed up anyway, and then I can put it into a coherent whole. And so I start off here. I'll talk about my grand theme, contention, Lear as psychological profile. Obviously, like, because a lot of your marginalia or your note taking will be in order to serve an aim. And if my aim is to do a lecture, obviously I want my lecture to be interesting, and I want a thread running through the whole thing. So I thought, well, that's a pretty good one to start. And then I'm just running, I've got some place notes here that I'll fill out, like here are some more contentions, and then here's some ideas that I want to expound upon. And then what I've done here is I've just taken from my Kindle notes. So I'll highlight my Kindle book and I'll cut out a note, and then I've put obviously who I'm quoting here, so that's it within easy reach. And if I go down here, I've got themes to hit on, and I've put a few here, but obviously you can see it's not expanded yet, but it will. And then I've got this section quotes to pull apart, and I'm just noting down some quotes. Not done anything with them yet, but some of them I've put under a theme, like this one under sight. Come up with another theme here, nihilism, entropy, division, but I've not put anything under that yet. And you can kind of see it sort of coming together in a way. And if you want to see my notes on Kindle, I'm not as good with that, but I do make do. I don't really like ebooks as much as paperback. I get more value out of the paperback. It feels more real, and I like the tactile, sensation of writing on the book and handling the book and having it to hand. Whereas it doesn't feel as real when it's on Kindle. But I do like with Kindle, you can have so many books at once, which is really nice. So you can kind of see, let's go into Aristotle's Poetics. And you go into my notebook. Obviously, you can do different color codes, right, when you're highlighting. So you can do like red, orange, yellow, blue. Sometimes I have an idea of what they mean, sometimes not. In my mind, red is a real standout. Blue usually means that I've got a nuance to add to it. So you can see here, if you go into my notebook, I've highlighted this. You can see all my other highlights in one place, which is quite nice. And you can just see, like, I've made little notes. Aristotle talks about tragedy having 6 component parts: plot, character, diction, reasoning, spectacle, and lyric poetry. So for me, to get personal value out of this, I've just wrote a little note to myself: break this down and work on these in assignment fashion. So I thought, well, because I'm a writer, I want to work on the 6 components that Aristotle thinks are key to tragedy, or to fiction anyway. So, maybe one month I'm going to work on plot, and then maybe one month I'm going to work on character. And obviously Aristotle talks about these in depth, so whilst I'm working on character, or whilst I'm working on lyric poetry, I can see how he guides me through that. So you can kind of see how now I've made Aristotle my teacher. He's my writing instructor, and he's kind of helping me through the writing process, which is pretty cool. Now, obviously, if you want to mark your books, the greatest books that have ever been produced are available readily cheap. You can get them very, very cheap. You can get Aristotle for $1, a couple of quid. You can get Shakespeare for next to nothing. So it's very much, it's an investment that's going to pay off dividends, because when you buy a book, you're not just buying the physical property, you're actually making an investment in your thought and your development as a human being. And so I think $1 for that is pretty good. Or if you want a really good version of Shakespeare, I'd recommend the Arden. That's like £10 in England or something like that. I love the introductions. A little thing about introductions: when you're reading, I would say don't read the introduction first. You want to make up your own mind. You don't want to read a text before in view of what somebody else has already said. So the guy that wrote the introduction to King Lear, he spent 20 fucking years like studying the play, and then he's very narrowly boxed himself into this way. And you want insight to come from naivety. So you coming fresh to the play, bring that insight, because that's an asset. And then afterwards you can look at what the expert has to say. That's my recommendation. So have a little quick look at Tolstoy. This is just one that I've recently started marking up, so you can kind of see what the process looks like out of nowhere. Even though it's fiction and you want a piece of imaginative literature just work upon you, you want to sort of befriend the characters, be at home in the world, and wrestle with the issues they're wrestling with. So you want complete immersion, but now and then you probably still do want to read fiction as though it's non-fiction, as though it's like self-help. So I'm still, when I'm reading Tolstoy, I'm not making as many notes as usual. I'm just kind of immersing myself and letting it unfold before me. But I'm still perking up every now and then. So I've noticed a quote here: bridge over an abyss, and suddenly saw that the bridge had been taken down, and below him was the bottomless deep. I've just put Nietzsche. Again, I want to get back into the story quite quickly, so I don't need to write too much. But I probably, once I finish the book, I want to come back, look at that bit, and then I want to get my Nietzsche, and I want to put them together, and I want to think about that. So that's that. Right, so that's my advice for how to mark and annotate a book, how to think more deeply. And just, I want to leave you with this idea that when you're reading a book, there are 4 main things you want to keep in mind. When you're reading, ask yourself, what is the book saying? What's the argument? What's going on? What's happening? Okay? 2, what is it saying in detail? Now that you know what it's saying, how is it emphasizing that with detail? And that might be poetic detail, that might be expanding upon a logical argument, and so on. Then you want to ask yourself, is it true? Does this ring true to you? Now, you're still not making any judgments, you're just trying to logically say, is that true? Now, obviously what's true is going to be different for a philosophical work than an imaginative piece of work. Writers of imaginative literature take a lot of liberties, and you've got to kind of suspend your disbelief a little bit. Coleridge called that willing suspension of disbelief. So imaginative literature is true in a different sense. Like, things can be very much untrue in detail, but true in sentiment. That's different for philosophy, for example. But ask yourself, is it true? And then finally, you want to ask yourself, what of it? So what? What's being said? How's it being said? Is it true? So what? What of it? So that's how I mark my books. And let me know, are you going to mark your books now? Have I convinced you? If so, what book are you going to start marking? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this content, I'd really appreciate if you like and subscribe, because that tells me that you appreciated it, and I'll keep making more videos. Thank you for watching, and happy reading.